Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and Alim Somji this morning. This is a great conversation that we've got lined up for you this morning. And it's the first time back in a little bit. So thank you for coming back. Thank you for tuning in and watching. And of course, you can always catch this on the replay as well. Just before I introduce Alim properly, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge our First Peoples and the historical significance that they have to Canada. And in particular, where I live in Muskoka, I want to honor the Chippewas of Rama, the Wattamohawk First Nation, and Moon River Métis and Inuit peoples. This is just a small part of reconciliation and really paying attention to the generations of First Nations people, our First Peoples who have been here long before we came. So wherever you are, I hope that you can also just take a silent moment and acknowledge the First Peoples where you are. So thank you for allowing me to do that. And as I already said, I'm super excited to be introducing Alim Somji and having a conversation about AboutFace, which is Canada's only not-for-profit organization providing programming, education, and advocacy for people with facial differences. So without further ado, welcome, Alim. Thank you so much for being here.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And I just have to say that Alim, so being the vice chair of AboutFace is not your full-time job. You are also the executive vice president of Jaffer's group of companies, which is real estate investments and properties in Edmonton. And so this is very early in the morning for you. So I truly appreciate you getting up early to be here for this event.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure. Wonderful. Absolutely my pleasure.
Great. And I'll watch the chat if you've got any comments, if you've got any questions. If I'm looking down to the side, that just means that I'm checking the feed over on LinkedIn. And I'll take a moment from time to time to make sure that I'm answering, or that you're answering questions. I'm asking the questions.
No problem at all.
I think it probably makes sense. A lot of people, I had no idea that the organization AboutFace existed or any of the work that you did until I ran across Peter Istvan's headshot photography. He's a local photographer, and he did a fantastic job of profiling a number of folks at AboutFace. And so, but let's just start with what the organization is and what AboutFace does.
Sure. So the organization has been around for a number of years. I remember receiving the newsletter when I was quite young. My facial difference I've had since I was born, and the organization now is keenly focused on advocacy for Canada's facial difference communities. So the facial difference community comprises of a number of different conditions, a number of different periods of life. In the past, we had a lot of primarily children's programming, but I think as time has gone on, I think it's become more and more apparent how important the adult experience is, and how mental health challenges certainly have continued into adult life. And bullying doesn't stop when you hit 18 and magically change. So AboutFace is really geared towards providing vital information for those who have facial differences or family members of those who have facial differences, providing advocacy and really creating awareness in the wider community of facial differences. Simply saying, facial differences exist, people have them. These are the types of things that people can experience, in addition to providing peer support and some kind of community building amongst the facial difference community to bring people with shared experiences and kind of have that same background context together to discuss their experiences and hopefully learn and gain from each other.
And we'll provide some contact information at the end of the session so that people can check it out. And I put a couple of links in the promotional piece around this event. Before getting into workplace, because you've got a new initiative in that I want to talk about that I think is relevant to the audience. But language is important. And it was the first thing that I noticed when I spoke to Namrit, who helped me organize you for this event at AboutFace. It's difference. So talk a little bit about the importance of language when it comes to your community and or the community, and why that word.
I think the other terms that we use, generally speaking, come with a lot of baggage. And, from an awareness and from an overall perspective, the difference between the community and those outside is simply that. It's a difference. It's not necessarily a positive or a negative relative to the rest of society, and we're still members of society. And, I would say the word difference simply implies the one thing, the one visible thing that makes us different as people. And so, we chose that word specifically because, it carried the least amount of weight with it. And I think one of the problems that, many stigmatized communities have, and it's not just this one, the language that we use to reference those communities tends to categorize individuals in ways over and above what that simple difference might be. And so we want to be in a position where you're providing the most equity up front, not necessarily from an emotional perspective, but simply put, just from a person-to-person perspective, to allow that individual the most opportunity to show their real personality and their true potential. And so, and really, so much of the work of the organization is really about that, because I feel, for the most part, awareness is always going to be the biggest problem. You don't meet many people with facial differences in your day-to-day life. And so that awareness is extremely important. And that awareness is really what's going to drive equity in the workplace, or equity in society, or just an acknowledgement or an understanding that people with facial differences exist, and almost as a fact of life. So the word difference is important because it doesn't carry with it anything else. It gives that person the opportunity to really tell their own story, and in a manner that is most consistent with them. And so, it's extremely important to us. And I know, for the most part, it might feel like a very small thing, but I think for a lot of members of the community, it's difficult to separate your feelings from, the other types of words that you can imagine might be used. It's difficult to separate your feelings from that, and the kind of the isolation and stigma that's associated with those words, rather than simply just seeing it as a word that somebody uses to describe something that they're not familiar with. And so that difference word is important, is important for us to the greater extent that it can be adopted in any event.
Yeah. And it, to me, it also speaks to different means not the same, which means unique. And unique is can be a very positive word. And so it's I reshared a video that you had done recently, a 3-minute clip, and you talked about You've got short people and tall people, and you've got people, well, I wear glasses, you don't. You can see our gender differences on the camera. And so it's the other thing that you talk about a lot is normalizing. And so tell us a little bit about what comes to your mind and why that is also so important.
Sure. In my mind, and I use the word normalizing kind of in a very broad sense, because in my mind, that's what it is. So, generally speaking, in the media and most of our idea of what different and uniqueness is comes from media, from social media, from wider media, from commercials and advertisements and whatnot. And so most of that understanding, therefore, of what is acceptable comes from those areas as well, because that's what we see. And what we see, generally speaking, is what, in our minds becomes normal. There are not a lot of facially different people, generally speaking, in advertisements, and that's changed a lot, I have to say, over the last few years, from companies that I'll be honest, I otherwise wouldn't have expected it from Nike and Lululemon, and a lot of, and Adidas, a lot of the sportswear companies that are having facially different people within their advertisements, which is excellent. That is really what it's going to take to normalize the facially different experience to the wider world. And I think the point and the goal of most EDI policies generally, I know we're not speaking about HR yet, but the goal of most policy is meant to create inclusivity, are really to normalize those things such that those policies no longer have to exist, because that's entrenched in your corporate environment or your societal values.
Right.
That's what normalization, I think, is for us. And generally speaking, given that people with facial differences don't really fall under most EDI policies or under most, government charter rights, we're not named under the Canadian Charter, or nor most others that exist in countries around the world. We're visibly different and we're seen as different, yet there's not necessarily that protection that comes with that. And so normalization is extremely important for us. To the greater extent that people with facial differences are visible and are seen in the community for things over and above their facial differences, that will create that familiarity for people that, when you see somebody that's facially different in the supermarket aisle behind you, that acknowledgement won't be, a bad joke, or it won't be a stare. It'll just be, there's a person behind me in the supermarket, and I should bring one of the plastic things to put on the grocery conveyor belt in order to create separation. Those are the simplest things. At the simplest levels. That's what normalization is.
There's an interesting stat. So if you go to AboutFace, into some of the resources, AboutFace as an organization did a survey in 2022, and there's a great one-pager that highlights everything in every area of life, including workplace, which we're going to dig into. But so 35% of people with facial differences face denial of that facial difference or the impact of it. So what is the difference between, acknowledging, the person behind me has a facial difference? That's a conversation I'm having in my head, and I smile at them the way I smile at anybody. And then denial. Like, what is denial? People who have facial differences and feel that they're different, that they're not being acknowledged. Is that different?
I think it is, and the difference may be subtle. I think the way I would describe it is it's a difference of what is accepted to be quote unquote right. So, you know, I may see something in front of me. I may see somebody jaywalking.
Mm-hmm.
And inherently, I know that's not right, but it's not necessarily unacceptable. I'm going to see 10 different people jaywalk. If you're in Toronto, see 30, right? Of people jaywalking across the street. And inherently, you know that that's not right, but it happens,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's the difference between crossing at a crosswalk and that. There's a question of what's right. So I could acknowledge something and still not feel it's right. Somebody can see me and still not feel, oh, there's something wrong with that person,
Mm.
right? That is still denial. That person is still incorrect. There's a problem. There's something wrong. Whereas, acceptance is that's a person, and end of story. And so again, and I know in a lot of ways there's a lot of subtleties to it, and I think for the most part, I would say that generally speaking, within the wider world, within society in general, I think most people are willing to give that benefit of the doubt, or are not necessarily there's not necessarily any mean or bad feelings that go into a lot of these things. It's simply just a lack of exposure that, you see something that you're not familiar with. How do I react? Because that reaction is a split second. And for people within the facial difference community, that reaction is, people logged on to this video feed to see this discussion today, and they'll see my face because that's what's on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's different about me. And so it's that reaction. The moment somebody sees somebody with the facial difference or sees somebody that's different, how is that reaction interpreted? How do you interpret that within your mind? What experiences do you have to draw on whether that is right or wrong?
Right.
A child doesn't know that crossing the street is necessarily a bad thing. You cross the street under certain conditions. That's what makes it right or wrong.
Right.
And it's a question of providing that understanding, providing that context, meeting other people with facial differences. It's those types of things that will create the context in order to make something truly accepted or normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would assume that it's just such a subtle thing that's felt. There was a a reaction or an avoidance or something that tells you that it's being avoided, or that somebody is not comfortable.
And,
Go ahead.
no, and what I would say is again, I would want to highlight, like, I don't think it's something that's done maliciously. It's simply a question of a lack of exposure to individuals that have facial differences, simply, and there's not a lot of us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, one of the reasons, and probably I would say the biggest reason an organization like AboutFace exists is to tell those stories and show people that individuals with facial differences exist, and
Mm-hmm.
it's normal, and you're going to encounter these people on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And within the business sense, the people that we rely on to have those discussions are human resource professionals. They're the ones who interact with the widest number of people. They're the ones that those with issues come to when there's a situation that needs to be addressed. Within that sphere, there's a lot of power to create that awareness and understanding and normalization. It really falls to that level, and there's a significant amount of power within an organization that sits in that chair.
So that's a great segue too. So let's start talking more deeply about the initiative. I believe it was September, November of last year, where AboutFace turned from not from, but in addition to sort of the family, community, children programming, a specific initiative to target workplace
Mm-hmm.
and recruiting and so there were some really interesting stats. Again, I'm looking down at the 2022 survey, and the 37% of respondents reported that their facial differences wasn't included. Now, this goes beyond work diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. School policies is included in this as well. So what is that report intended to do, and what could people who are listening to this event start to take note of? Because, as you said, it's not part of the charter of differences and DE&I initiatives.
What I would say is it's really meant to do two things. It's meant, at its simplest, it's meant to highlight an issue. Simply to say there is a group of people that are not recognized within most policies that are being written or most policies that are in place in a number of organizations that it may be of value to pay attention to, or that you may encounter in a workplace setting. And the other thing I think it's meant to do is to describe an opportunity. And that opportunity is one where, you go out to a number of different businesses and say, look, there's an underserved group of people that feel that the experiences that they have are not adequately being recognized by the employers that they're working with. So the opportunity is, if I extend the olive branch and if I, educate myself, if I learn about the challenges that somebody with facial differences can go through and the stories that somebody with facial difference might have, there's an opportunity to bring in talent that might otherwise be overlooked. And I think one of the reasons that it became apparent, both from what those in the community had shared with us and from those outside, is that it was difficult getting hired. And we're coming out of COVID where, 90% of our business interviews were held just like this over the camera. And again, really all you see is my face, and that's about it, right?
Yep.
So, there's a lot that comes from that initial interaction. When we sit down, the history shows that the first discussion that we have and the first impression that you make will be of appearance, whether that's right or wrong. That just is. And the question is, given that my appearance will be different and it's not going to be normal, we're not at normalization yet, it's not going to be normal. We accept that it's not going to be normal. What are the types of things we can do to make it an equitable opportunity? And to greater or less extent, what are the types of things we can do to make sure that that person and anybody else who interviews with us is comfortable and that we can get the best possible hire and the best possible seat in our organization? And those things, to me, is an opportunity for an awareness, and it's an opportunity to improve the hiring practices that we have and to get better people through the door. Because, as I would argue, and obviously I guess I'm kind of biased given that I have a facial difference, I would argue that the backgrounds and the stories and the experiences of somebody with a facial difference makes them an extremely compelling hire. Given that, there's a lot of perseverance. There's a story behind somebody with a facial difference coming to your doorstep. There's a history of trials and tribulations and things that somebody has gone through, especially from a societal extent, from a, going through childhood as somebody being different. There's something to be learned and there's something to be gained by going through that experience. That difference is meaningful. And so it's a question of how can it be meaningful within your organization? How is that experience beneficial to you? And in my mind, I believe that there's a lot of ways that it is.
Yeah. I remember you and I having this conversation when we first chatted, and I really hadn't thought about that. I mean, I've never really been in HR, even though I've been, responsible for the learning and development within organizations. But the old school behavioral interview, tell me about a time when, blah, 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 when you were challenged. There aren't very many examples that you would, if you're rehearsing your interviewing skills alone or with somebody else, you're not going to talk about the experiences in your life. You're going to keep those experiences at work. And yet, overall, HR folks, start to expand the overall conversation in these interviews that you're doing, because you're absolutely right. Somebody who has faced the statistics around bullying and the staring, the uncomfortable situations that people find themselves in. These numbers are pretty startling. But that builds character and perseverance, as you just said.
It does. And, what I would say is that in an interview setting, I would say most people, not just those with facial differences, I would say most people will look for examples that they feel are going to be most applicable from a business setting. It's a business interview, I'm trying to get a job. So when somebody asks me about difficulties I've encountered in the workplace, it's going to be extremely uncomfortable to bring up a personal situation, given that you don't want to be stigmatized off the bat. You don't want to be seen as somebody who's going to complain or cause disruption, et cetera, et cetera. But you also want to look for something that is going to tell people, I understand the role that you're hiring me for. Here is an experience that I had doing the thing that you want me to do, and here's how I solved it. Where, what I would argue is that when you encounter somebody with a facial difference, in many senses, that facial difference alone tells a story of perseverance and of dedication to building a career in the face of challenges and in the faces of tribulations, and that societal issues. In many cases, that's health issues for a lot of those with facial differences. There are a lot of experiences that have been managed and have been worked through in order to get to that position in front of the HR professional or the person hiring, in order for that conversation to ever have occurred.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, there's, in my mind, and again, I'm biased, there's a confidence that you can have that, by bringing somebody with a facial difference onto your team, or any difference onto your team, that background and that context that individual has will be beneficial for your organization, because a lot of the things that you try and that you hope you have when you hire somebody, you hope you have somebody that's going to be dedicated. You hope you have somebody that's going to be diligent and disciplined and persevere through hardship and work to learn through challenges rather than be defeated by them. All these things we hope. It's difficult, and thousands of papers have been written to how to identify whether people are those people. Whereas in my mind, if you have somebody that's different, that's grown up different, or that has experienced that sort of societal pressure that having a facial difference does, a lot of that is implied because they're in front of you.
Yeah.
And there's a level of courage and bravery that it takes, in my mind, for somebody to be sitting in a video interview or to come in and have that discussion with you, knowing that the first reaction they're going to get to somebody that doesn't know them is going to be one of, best case, shock.
Right.
Worst case, something worse, negative perception off the bat that you're going to have to battle through.
Right.
And so the fact that that person is there and the fact that the discussion is being had, in my mind, is extremely valuable. And that value is something that, as employers, you're looking to find that secret sauce into how to find those people regularly and consistently that are willing to go to bat for you, that are willing to do those things, and that will continue to show up and show courage in the face of, you know, the challenges that a business might face.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's something I feel that that is hireable.
Yes. Yeah. We could talk all day, but guess what? We've run out of time. And so I want to, I'm just going to forward to the next slide here. So AboutFace, it's very simple. AboutFace.ca is how you can start to get in touch with the folks if you're in HR, if you on any level are looking for supports or how to be how to normalize the conversation. I hope that we've done a little bit here in terms of expanding the conversation around diversity and inclusion. And I really want to thank you, Alim, for taking the time again so early in the morning to be here and talk about what is a really important subject. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And next week, I've got another great guest. I'll put out some information later on today about Annie Kipp and her Smart Deck, which is Smart Cards, which is a great coaching tool and strategic planning tool. And if you know of anyone who you think might want to be a guest on the show, who has a story to tell, who has something that's important, that needs a voice, please get in touch with me. And thank you, Carl, for your comment. Yes, I mean, Alim has such amazing insights. And thank you so much for sharing. So until next time, everyone, have a fantastic day.